Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this revision lesson, which is about the topic of Elizabeth's troubles at home and abroad. So, in this revision lesson, we're going to be looking at religious matters and the question of religion. Really thorny issue in the rule of Elizabeth I, having taken the throne in 1558 after years of religious turbulence, changes between Catholicism and Protestantism. So, we're going to look at that, her religious settlement. We're going to look at the increasing threats towards that religious settlement. Things like the Northern Rebellion of 1569, her excommunication from the Catholic Church in 1570, the role of missionaries such as Jesuit priests, for example. We're going to look at the Catholic plots, very much linked to Mary Queen of Scots as well, and the threat to the Elizabethan religious settlement, not just from the Catholics, but also from the Puritans. We're then going to look at how Elizabeth responded to those threats with increasingly harsh and repressive measures, and ultimately make a judgment about how successful we would regard the Elizabethan religious settlement. So, without further ado, let's find out more. So we're going to look at the Elizabethan religious settlement, we're going to look at Catholic opposition and Elizabeth's response to it, and we're also going to look at the Puritan opposition and Elizabeth's response to that as well in this part of the revision video. So this slide just gives you the context, the Elizabethan religious settlement, which Elizabeth brought in 1559. So England had been very much on a religious roller coaster between the rule of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. So Henry VIII changed the church from Catholic to Protestant, but Henry wasn't really a true Protestant, and many sort of Catholic ways and Catholic ideas continued. His son Edward VI brought about many more Protestant changes, and he was a very fervent, very committed Protestant. So the church that he created was very Protestant in its nature. He died, of course, in 1553, and his elder sister, Mary, became the Queen. Mary was a Catholic, so she returned England to Catholicism. Some Protestants were burned during this time, giving her the name Bloody Mary. So when Elizabeth came to the throne, she needed to bring about a religious settlement to kind of keep the people in the country happy and to find what she would call a middle way between Catholics and Protestants. So she created a Protestant church, but with some allowances for Catholics. It's true to say that in the first sort of 10 years of her rule, the Elizabethan religious settlement was very successful. But as her rule continued, she faced increased opposition, particularly after the arrival of Mary Queen of Scots in England in 1568. She faced more Catholic opposition, which led to harsher anti-Catholic laws. And she also, into the 1570s and beyond, faced opposition from Puritans as well, that would have preferred the church to take a much more stronger Protestant line. Religious strife continued into the rule of James I. The Gunpowder Plot, of course, was a Catholic plot, and even into the time of the English Civil War, the concern of Charles I being quite Catholic in his ways led to kind of conflict. So it would be a long time before religion was truly settled, but certainly the Elizabethan religious settlement was a very significant moment in terms of religious change in England during this time. So what was the Elizabethan religious settlement? Well, Elizabeth had been brought up as a Protestant. Her mother was Anne Boleyn, and she wanted to find a middle way to create the order and stability within England during her rule. So there were three kind of main questions to kind of deal with, and you can look at what the Catholic, Protestant, and Puritan response would have been at the time. The Elizabethan religious settlement was basically made up of a couple of laws. The first one was the Act of Supremacy, which said that Elizabeth was the supreme governor of the Church of England. Now, this was a compromise in not using the phrase head of the Church of England to kind of keep Catholics on side. In terms of what the churches should look like, Elizabeth kept a few decorations and ornaments in the churches, such as candlesticks on the altar, which would have upset the Puritans, but kept some Catholics happy. And the Act of Uniformity was the other aspect of the Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559. Basically said all worship should be the same, and everyone had to follow the Book of Common Prayer in English, and the priests wore religious robes, and some of the vestments that were chosen for the priests to wear was also a compromise towards some of the Catholics in England at the time. So this kind of gives you the sort of full information, and I think it's important to note that this was a middle way. So it was a Protestant church that Elizabeth created, but it did have some elements in it to appease Catholics. And one of the things which is a good quote to remember is that Elizabeth said that she did not want to, quote, see windows into men's souls. So she wanted people to outwardly conform, but she didn't want to kind of change people's views. So if somebody remained strongly Catholic, as long as they didn't kind of go on about it, then Elizabeth was going to be happy. So the Act of Supremacy, that re-established a break with Rome, created an independent Church of England, and she became the supreme governor. The Act of Uniformity made going to church compulsory, the new Book of Common Prayer, the Bible in English. The wording of the communion service was kept vague enough so it was acceptable to both Catholics and Protestants, and the churches were allowed to keep some decorations, and priests had to wear Catholic vestments or robes. So again, there were some ideas there to keep Catholics happy. Okay, so her middle way charted a course between sort of Catholicism and Puritanism, and as we will see in this presentation, Elizabeth would face increased opposition during her rule from both Catholics who wanted the church to become Catholic, and Puritans that wanted to remove all Catholic elements from the church and wanted the church to be further reformed. So opposition to the Elizabethan religious settlement grew, and I think this is partly because there was a Catholic tradition in England, particularly in the north of England, in the northwest, especially in places like Lancashire, also quite a Catholic element in Yorkshire as well. So those ideas weren't going to just go overnight. The places which were most loyal to the Protestant ideas would have been the southeast and the areas around London. Puritanism was particularly strong within London as well. One of the key turning points in terms of more opposition to her religious settlement was Mary Queen of Scots coming to England in 1568. Now, Mary Queen of Scots was a Catholic, but she also had a very strong claim to the throne in the Stuart claim, and to many, she was the heir to the throne. So this meant that had Elizabeth have died, she didn't have any of her own children, then Mary Queen of Scots could have been the successor. And what Mary's arrival in England did in 1568 is it galvanized Catholic opposition. It gave them a figurehead really to rally around, and served to really inspire the sort of Catholic opposition to feel that they could actually change things. And therefore this spurred things like the Northern Rebellion in 1569, which was a Catholic rebellion in the north led by the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, and they focused on a plot for the Duke of Norfolk, who was one of the leading nobles at the time, to marry Mary Queen of Scots and set her up as the heir to the English throne, and to be a Catholic heir to the English throne. In response, the Pope Pius V, excommunicated Elizabeth from the Catholic Church in 1570, which basically was designed to encourage Catholics in England to rise up against Elizabeth. And basically, the arrival of Mary Queen of Scots in England helped spark off and inspire a series of plots, and it's important that you learn the names of those plots. So the Ridolfi plot of 1571, the Throckmorton plot of 1583, and the Babington plot of 1586. Now we can see that Elizabeth responded with the Treason Act to basically make it punishable by death to deny the supremacy of the church in England, and to promote Catholicism, and this was very much passed in response to the Ridolfi plot. So if you have a look at the Northern Rebellion, you can pause that and read that in your own time. But basically, the Northern Rebellion is basically organised by the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland. It involves the Duke of Norfolk. And this is the most serious rebellion that takes place within Elizabeth's rule. So you can see there that in November 1569, the rebels captured Durham. They celebrated Mass in Durham Cathedral. They managed to march as far south towards Tutbury in Derbyshire, the plan to, get hold of Mary Queen of Scots. But Elizabeth was able to rely on her army in order to repel the rebels and to stop them reaching Tutbury in the sort of Midlands area in Derbyshire. And many of the soldiers in the end deserted. And one of the key interesting features of the Northern Rebellion is that although this was a rallying point for Catholicism, many of the Catholics within the North didn't actually rebel. Many of them chose to support the Queen. And this is one of the reasons why the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570, because it was basically a plan to try and persuade the Catholics in England to rise up against Elizabeth and to get involved in Catholic rebellions. So laws became a lot harsher. So 3 events showed that the Catholics had become a very serious threat. So Mary Queen of Scots becomes a magnet for Catholic conspiracy. The excommunication of Elizabeth from the Catholic Church encourages Catholics to oppose her. And then from 1570, in 1570s, Catholic missionaries called Jesuits began to arrive in England. And the role of Jesuit priests, they were trained to do this, was to basically come to England to try and encourage the spread of Catholicism. We'll look more about that in a moment. So harsher laws to control the Catholics involved the Treason Act, which said anyone who claimed she was not the rightful queen was a traitor. In 1581, the government passed the Act of Persuasions, which increased the fine for not attending a church service to £20 per month. Now, for comparison, in 1559, that was 12 pence, and only the wealthiest Catholics would be able to afford that fine. Those who refused to attend church were called recusants. And those who refused to pay the fines were imprisoned, and land could be taken off them. So there were some really harsh laws to basically control people that were refusing to go to church on a Sunday, and for not abiding by the Protestant faith. Now, to tackle the threat of Jesuit priests and Catholic priests in general, in 1585 an act against priests was passed, which basically gave priests 40 days to leave the country. Being a Catholic priest was made treasonable, and anyone helping a Catholic priest could face the death penalty. Now, some of the homes of these sort of wealthier Catholic families in the north, they would house priests, and they would house these rather elaborate priest holes where priests would be able to hide out. In sort of Catholic churches could be disguised as houses, for example. So lots and lots of laws to restrict Catholics during this time, which was, fairly successful in terms of controlling the Catholic threat. So there's 2 types of priests during this time. So there's Jesuit priests that are specially trained to persuade people to become Catholics and convert to Catholicism from the Protestant religion, or to deepen their Catholic faith. And some examples of that are Robert Parsons and Edmund Campion. And then the seminary priests were trained to support Catholics to deepen their faith, but not to actually convert to the Protestant religion. So there's some various information there. The first sort of missionary priests, they reach England around about 1574, but some good case studies are the missionary priests of Robert Parsons and Edmund Campion, who entered the country in 1580. Campion was actually executed for treason in December 1581. The sort of role of the priests largely failed. It was estimated by 1603 there were just around about 40,000 Catholics left in the country. So most people, the Catholic religion within England was decimated really within the rule of Elizabeth I, and some of these harsher laws that were passed during this time were very much responsible for that actually happening. And I think probably as well there's a sense in England at that time that many people would have changed their beliefs from Protestant to Catholic and Catholic back to Protestant, during this kind of Tudor period, in order to follow the example set by the monarch, to follow the rules in society, etc. So his case study of Edmund Campion, smuggled into England in June 1580. He produced pamphlets that were distributed by Catholics in 1580. He travelled around the country in disguise, between different gentry houses, hiding in priest holes where necessary. But he was actually captured in July 1581 by George Eliot, who was a very famous spy and a priest catcher. The priest catchers were sometimes known as poursuivants. Took 2 days to find him, but he was captured, he was tortured, revealed the names of other Catholics, and found guilty of treason, sentenced to death, and he was hung, drawn and quartered. Now, it's interesting that he was hung, drawn and quartered. He's not actually killed in the traditional religious heretic way of being burnt, but actually hung, drawn and quartered because he was seen as a traitor to the country, and that's sort of shown in the way that he was killed. So there was also other opposition from Catholics. So a good example of that is the Catholic martyr Margaret Clitheroe. Elizabeth ordered the execution of lots of Catholics during her rule, around about 200. Margaret Clitheroe was a butcher's wife. She was accused of sheltering priests. She refused to plead guilty or not guilty, and she was actually killed in the end by being pressed, which is when a door was placed over her body and heavy weights were added in order to crush her to death. And she became a Catholic martyr. And this is just one example of opposition from Catholics during this time. So Elizabeth also faced opposition from Puritans. Now, Puritans were particularly opposed to the continuation of bishops within the church. They didn't like the hierarchical structure of the church, and they also didn't like the vestments worn by Protestant clergy. Now, Elizabeth had, a privy council that was made up of both traditional Protestants but also Puritans. And one of the most famous Puritans at the court was Elizabeth's favourite, Robert Dudley. Now, I think the increase in Puritan opposition from around about the 1570s can be explained by the fact that Puritans hoped that Elizabeth's religious settlement would be the first step on a journey to bring in the Puritan sort of values and ideas into England. But actually, Elizabeth saw the Elizabethan religious settlement as the end point. That was the final point. That was the final settlement to create stability within England. So once the Puritans began to realise this and realise that Elizabeth wasn't going to bring in any further religious change, that's where the opposition from Puritans increased. So let's find out how the Puritans did oppose Elizabeth. So one of the good examples is the Puritan Thomas Cartwright. He called in 1570 for the abolition of bishops and refused to refer to Elizabeth as supreme governor. Elizabeth, however, liked the idea that the church reinforced the Elizabethan hierarchy. She wanted that focus on the great chain of being. There were pamphlets that would criticise the structure and beliefs of the church. Elizabeth banned her MPs from discussing religious matters. That's one of the reasons why the Puritan MP, Peter Wentworth, challenged this, and he ended up being imprisoned a couple of times in the Tower of London for that. So some specific examples, there's the opposition from Edmund Grindal, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, Elizabeth was concerned that he was spreading Puritan ideas around the country by holding prayer meetings. Now, holding these prayer meetings, which were Puritan inspired, was known as prophesying. And she asked Grindal to shut down this practice, and when he refused, she placed him under house arrest for 7 years until his death in 1583. So from 1576 to 1583, the Puritan sympathising Archbishop of Canterbury, Edmund Grindal, was kept under house arrest. Now, in 1583, when Grindal died, he was replaced by John Whitgift, and he was a much more traditionally Protestant person. He issued 3 articles forcing all clergy to swear acceptance of bishops, issued a new prayer book, and it led to 300 ministers being suspended. Another example of Puritan opposition is that there's the Puritan William Stubbs, who was also an MP as well. He had his hand cut off for writing a pamphlet criticising Elizabeth. There's also Robert Brown. So he created a breakaway church known as the Separatist or Brownist, named after him, and began to produce Puritan pamphlets. So in 1593, as a response, the government passed what was called the Act Against Seditious Sectaries. Seditious means something that goes against, what the kind of current thinking is, or what the acceptable thinking is, and that allowed anyone to allow the authorities to execute anyone accused of being a separatist or a Brownist. So overall, how successful was the Elizabethan religious settlement? Well, I think at first very successful. She appeased the vast majority of Catholics, Protestants and Puritans. We know that the Church of England remained the church even to this present day, the official church of the land. So the Elizabethan religious settlement created the foundations for the church we recognise today. Only 3% of priests refused to swear the oath of loyalty to her, and there were no real serious threats to it before 1568. I suppose how it might have failed is that we do see increased Catholic and Puritan opposition after 1568, particularly from the Catholics, with the Catholic plots like the Ridolfi plot, Throckmorton and Babington plot. The religious settlement, of course, favoured the Protestants. Elizabeth ended up getting excommunicated by the Pope, which was an issue, and she did have to persecute and increase her executions of Catholics after the sort of mid-1570s, partly as a response to Jesuit priests. Okay, so we've recovered there the religious matters. We've looked at the development of the Elizabethan religious settlement, the opposition from Catholics and Protestants, and how Elizabeth responded to this and the policies that she made, and overall how successful she was. So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that, and goodbye.